Linguistic anthropology focuses on the use of language within cultures or within societies. And from that, we can explore this topic of language from a lot of different angles. We can look at what language is actually composed of, how language might have originated by looking at physical characteristics and DNA in humans. We can, of course, also compare the communication styles of primates to what we do. We can look at how linguistic differences vary from group to group or within a single language group, but we can also look at the connections between language and culture and our brains. And so that's what this video is going to be about. I'm going to go through three of the big hypotheses that have emerged over the last century or so related to this language, culture, and brain interaction. The three theories that we'll be covering are universal grammar, the critical period hypothesis, and the SAPIR-WHORF hypothesis. Universal grammar is a concept that was developed first by Noam Chomsky, who's a very famous and very influential thinker and sociologist and philosopher and linguist. He said that every human has a similar ability to use language. That basically all of our brains are organized the same way or have the same architecture to support language. And so if you were to look at the brain of someone who speaks Mandarin and look at the brain of someone who speaks French and look at the brain of someone who speaks Farsi, there would be no physical differences and certainly no genetic differences between any of these people. We all have the same ability to learn any given language. Noam Chomsky used the existence of two linguistic forms to support his idea of universal grammar, and these are PIDGINS and CREOLES. And you probably heard those words before, but we're going to give them some very specific definitions here. So first, a pidgin. A pidgin is a linguistic communication system that's very simplified, and it develops when people who speak different native languages come together and need to communicate in some way. So if you imagine someone who speaks German and someone who speaks, let's say, Japanese, or rather a group of Germans and a group of Japanese come together, perhaps for trade or in a system of colonialism. If there is enough prolonged contact between these two groups of people, and each of them only speaks their native language, over time, they may start to develop a communication system where they borrow words from each of those two native languages. This can also happen with more than two languages, but it typically happens when people come together for some sort of trade or colonialism. This definitely happened in Hawaii, where you have people meeting in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, everyone needing to interact with each other. So you have people speaking Hawaiian language, you have people speaking Japanese, Chinese, Filipinos, you have English speakers as well, and everyone needs to communicate. So do they all learn every single language that might possibly be in the mix? No, they start to pick up words from each language and incorporate them into this very simplified form of speech. So if we imagine that we have a group of Spanish speakers, and these Spanish speakers speak only Spanish, and we have a group of English speakers who speak only English, and a group of French speakers who speak only French, over time we might start to see that these groups of people have started to borrow words from each other's languages so that they can communicate effectively, though in a very simple sort of way, between all members of the group. So if we have these Spanish, English, and French speakers, we might see, for example, if you wanted to express the message, I'm going to the beach, or I'm walking to the beach, perhaps we would pull in a French word at the beginning. We would say je. We know that je means I in French. And then we'll pull in a word from another language. So walk, je walk. We now have a concept of I walk. But we have our Spanish speakers in here as well, and of course we can pull in playa for beach. So here we have a sentence that would be considered a complete sentence in pidgin. Je walk playa. I walk beach. This isn't a fully fleshed out sentence, you'll notice. I walk beach isn't exactly the way that we would say something in English, for example. but it does communicate the basic point. So a pidgin is not a true language. Because it's so simplified, it doesn't contain all of those elements of speech that we expect to see in a full-blown language. We might not expect to see good creation of the tenses, past tense, present tense, and future tense. We might not expect to see all of the conjugation and verb agreements and articles and prepositions that we would expect to see in a full-blown language. But it is effective at communicating basic concepts between people who don't all speak the same language. Now, over time, a pidgin might turn into something a little bit different. When you have groups of people speaking a pidgin through multiple generations, lots of people now involved in the speaking of this pidgin, and especially if you get children incorporated into the speaking of this pidgin, through time, it might start to become more elaborated. And kids particularly are great at filling in all of the blanks, filling in those blank spaces where grammatical rules would generally exist. So if we have a sentence like je walk playa in our pidgin form, over time, as people naturally start elaborating the pidgin, we might see that je walk playa could turn into something like je walqué a la playa. So now we have a past tense sentence. I walked to the beach. It's fully fleshed out. It has all of those components of speech that we would expect to see in a true language. So a Creole is a completely elaborated language that is built from two or more different languages. Pidgins and Creoles, then, support the idea of universal grammar, because if there is an ability for humans to mix very different languages to create something new, then they must all have the same general components. They must all have nouns and verbs and adjectives. And if all languages have the same components, then that's because our brains are organized in a way to create languages that are similar across the entire human species. So there seems to be some pretty solid evidence here looking at pidgins and creoles for this idea of universal grammar. Our second theory of the language-brain-culture interaction is called the critical period hypothesis. And this is probably one of the least controversial hypotheses when it comes to how language and the brain sort of work together. So in the critical period hypothesis, it is believed that there is a window of time in each person's life where the brain is primed for learning a language. There's a certain window in which we can acquire language, and this happens when we're kids. The idea further is that once this window starts to close, it becomes harder and harder to learn a language. And we can see evidence for this by looking at second language learners and also these so-called feral children, or children who have sort of lived without any care. This window of time is generally considered to be from about birth to 7 years old. So we need to get access to language between the time we're born and the time we're 7. After 7 years old, it becomes a little bit harder for us to learn a language. And the older we get, the harder it becomes to learn that first language. So if a child hasn't learned any sort of language in those first 7 years, it's very likely that their abilities to learn language later will be significantly diminished. We can certainly see this in ourselves. Most of us are second language learners, or we have some experience in trying to learn another language. And we all know that the older you get, the harder it is to learn a second language. And certainly, we can see how easy it is for children to pick up. And while we might still be able to learn the basic components of a language later in life, it becomes more difficult to be truly, truly fluent. There are always going to be some things that we can't quite get if we learn a language as an adult. Things like accent, things like particular elements of dialect, certain terminology just won't be as easy for us to grasp. And so this feeds into the critical period hypothesis because it does tell us that the older we get, the harder it is for our brain to absorb language. We can see how the critical period hypothesis plays out with first language learners if we look at these so-called feral children. There are many, many myths and stories around the world of children who were raised in the wild, children raised by wolves or raised by monkeys or raised by bears, children who were somehow separated from human contact and had to somewhat fend for themselves. These stories are often hoaxes, and so there's not a lot of good, solid data about, looking at cases where kids have actually been raised by wild animals and outside of human contact. But we can see similar examples in children who have been subjected to very severe neglect. And so you may have heard about this young girl right here. Her name is Jeannie. You probably heard about her in sociology. Jeannie was about 12 years old when she was found by the police, and she was discovered in her father's home after having been neglected basically since the time that she was born. She was tied to a chair and prevented from moving around. She was kept in almost complete darkness. She was never really interacted with. And so when she was found at 12 years old, she could not speak. She couldn't really walk. She crawled around on all fours. She also couldn't eat with utensils or with her hands. She ate out of a bowl on the floor. She had been completely deprived of human contact. And so when she was found, she was determined to have the mental functioning capabilities of a very young child, maybe a 1-year-old child, because she missed out on that human contact and essentially the enculturation process. It's during the enculturation period of time where we also learn our languages. Even though she went through years and years of therapy following her removal from her parents' home, it was still very, very difficult for Jeannie to acquire language, and she never became fully competent in her use of language because she missed out on that critical period. This particular hypothesis has a lot of support behind it, and certainly we can feel the effects of this critical period in our daily lives. So this is one of the least contested ideas in linguistic anthropology. Our final hypothesis is the SAPIR-WHORF hypothesis, named after the two guys here who really did the theorizing about it, Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf. And this hypothesis states that different languages produce different ways of thinking. Or, according to the words of Benjamin Lee Whorf, language shapes the way we think and determines what we can think about. So basically, if we imagine all of the possibilities that exist in the world, we can only conceive of the possibilities that we have words for. Our languages constrain our thoughts, and they take all of those possibilities and reduce them down into a smaller set. This theory was first put forth after Edward Sapir's work with Hopi Indians in the American Southwest. So this is a Native American group, and Edward Sapir was studying the way that their language deals with time, essentially, or looking at various tenses within their language. Now, in the English language, we have 3 tenses. We have the past tense, we have the present tense, and we have the future tense. But in the Hopi language, there are really only 2 tenses. There are things that have happened, so essentially things that happened in the past, and then there are things that have not yet happened. And this might represent a little bit of the future and also represents the future and a little bit of the present tense. But there aren't 3 distinct stages, there are just 2. And another way of thinking about these 2 stages is that the things that have happened, those are things that are real. And then the stage that represents things that have not yet happened, those are things that are not real, or they're not real yet. This linguistic style of things that are real versus things that are unreal can apparently very significantly affect the ways that a person thinks about the world and the way that a person thinks about what is real and what is not real in their world. So imagine a dream, for example. We all dream. We do it every night, even if we don't remember it. When you wake up in the morning and you realize that you've had a dream the night before, that dream, it's something that has happened. You have dreamt. And so that dream is something that exists in the past. But for a Hopi language speaker, we would say that for them, because that dream has happened, that dream is now real. And possibly the things in the dream are equally real because they definitely happened in the past, even if it was part of a dream. So dreams then, for the Hopi, can be as real as the fact that you went to the store 2 weeks ago, because they are things that definitely happened in the past, compared to what you plan to do tomorrow or what you plan to cook for dinner tonight. Those things are not real. Those things are unknowable because they haven't transpired yet. And so in some ways, things like dreams perhaps have more power because they are more real than the plans that you have 5 minutes from now or 5 days from now. So the way that the language is structured has the ability to influence how you think of things as being real or not real, which is a pretty significant finding, a very interesting finding. A more recent study looked at people who speak languages that have distinct present tense and future tense versus languages that have sort of a combined future and present tense. And the premise of this study was that if you speak a language where the present and the future are kind of balled up in the same thing, then you save more money than people who have 3 distinct tenses, a past tense, a present tense, and a future tense in their language. And I like to think about it like this. If I have $500 in my pocket and my rent is due in 3 weeks, there are a couple of things I could do. I could say, let's be logical about this. I know that rent is going to be due in 3 weeks, so I'm going to save this $500 for my rent that I know that I will have to pay in the future. Or I could say, 3 weeks, that's a long time away. Rent is due very far in the future from now, and maybe that's a problem that I want future me to deal with. But present me wants to, I want to buy some new shoes, or I want to go out with my girlfriends tonight. And so maybe that $500 is better used on present me, and I'll let future me worry about future problems when that future time comes. But if you speak a language where the present and the future are sort of wrapped up in one, then you might not necessarily think, oh, I have rent due in 3 weeks. It's just rent is due. And so if you know that rent is due, you're going to make different choices than if you say rent is due sometime in the future that is very far away from now, right? If I have $500 in my pocket and I know rent's due tomorrow, I know where that $500 is going. So this study seems to suggest that when you conceive of the future and the present as somewhat the same thing, because your language is set up to make the future and the present somewhat the same thing, that affects the decisions that you make in your daily life, which is also a very, very cool study. Now, this is a very controversial hypothesis. And every time you have someone coming out saying, yes, I have support for the SAPIR-WHORF hypothesis, you have someone else coming out and saying, no, it doesn't make sense, that there are many other ways to explain sort of how language and culture interact. So a lot of people disagree with this hypothesis. And they say that language doesn't constrain the thoughts that we have. Instead, language responds to the thoughts we have. And so when we have new thoughts, then we elaborate our language to allow those thoughts. If I need a new word for something, then I make up a new word. And it's not that if I don't have a word for something, I can't imagine it existing. So we can look at a couple of examples of how this might work. Certainly we can talk about things like color, and maybe we'll save that example for class. But think about these three hypotheses. Think about their similarities, think about their differences. Try to think about examples of where you might see elements of each of these coming in if you have personal experiences that relate to any of these three. Think about how these also relate to the Nicaraguan sign language materials that are posted on Blackboard.